Thank you, everyone, for joining the session, and hopefully the previous sessions have been informative. I'm sure they are. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So the way we'll run the session is I have some slides, so we'll go through some of that, but really this should be us engaging, interacting, having questions, getting answers, because I think sales can be especially for a lot of the founders that I was working with many years ago, one of the most mysterious aspects of building, growing, and scaling a startup. So with that, let me go ahead and pop in slides for us to check out for our session today. But one thing right off the bat, if you do have questions afterwards, you want to reach out, you can scan the QR code. It goes to a link tree where you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and other things that I talk about generally from the AWS startups perspective. And so maybe to give some context as to who I am and why this topic is so interesting to me. So I've done a lot of different things. I've been a software developer, and then I went into enterprise sales. And when I founded my startup, it was in HR tech, pure enterprise play, big Fortune 500 customers. And after I exited that startup, I had a lot of startups and startup founders that would come to me, ask me about how to do B2B sales. And this actually evolved into an organization that I launched called the Enterprise Sales Forum, a global community for anyone to come and talk and learn about sales. That rolled into writing a book around how to build communities called Community in a Box. And the last thing I did before I joined AWS about 2.5 years ago as the global startup advocate is to help build out the SaaS business for Stack Overflow from the ground up. And in fact, this is totally random, but I'm actually wearing my Stack Overflow t-shirt today. So also, just a few notes before we launch into the content. This is about early stage sales, which obviously I think is pretty much everyone here today for this session. And obviously, the content is valuable for any stage of sales, wherever you are in your startup journey. And this is not about just all things sales. This is specifically around B2B SaaS sales. It has very specific motions. Obviously, again, you can take some of the lessons learned here and apply it to a B2C or maybe a business to government type of sales motion. But we're going to be talking about B2B sales. And also, I'm going to mention this term founder's passion. This talk has been targeted for founders of startups because I feel that's, again, this whole topic of sales tends to be a topic that seems a bit mysterious to a lot of startup founders, particularly if you come from a technology or product background. So we have a few topics that we're going to tackle today, and this is going to be a journey around how to build up that sales acumen and also build for scale as your startup scales, and so you have a team that can help provide the revenue uplift that you need to grow quickly. And it's important, though, that we start at the foundation. And when we talk about first principles of sales, I always pivot our conversations I have with founders, not to talk about processes. Like, sales process is important. You do need some tools like a CRM. Obviously, hiring right people is important. But ultimately, your foundation for sales starts with principles. And as an example, at Amazon, in AWS, one of our core principles in how we engage customers is that we focus on the customer first and work backwards from the challenges that they face. And this is something which is the guiding principle by how we engage and work with customers and how we operate from a sales team perspective, all driven by the values that we have, that we've codified over many years into 16 leadership principles. And this is important because from a customer obsession standpoint, it's not just something that we hold dear, it's also something that you see out there in the marketplace today. the buyers, the people that will be interested in your solution, in many cases, they've already been through most of the journey to learn and understand what solutions are out there. So you need to truly differentiate the way that you interact and engage with customers in order to win their trust and earn their business. So with that, in a lot of my own experience, not only as a founder, but also in acting as an operator and an advisor and mentor for many B2B tech startups in New York City, I started to see the repetitions of different sales motions and activities during the entire sales cycle, from engaging customers all the way to close and beyond. And I started to use my engineering mind to understand, well, what are some of the building blocks? And the building blocks I saw were these 12 things I'm going to run through quickly. And then after we have this foundation for operating an end-to-end sales motion, then we'll talk about the scaling aspects. So these are the 12 building blocks that I'd identified, and through many conversations seems to have been verified by many founders who've gone through this process of building out their sales team from the ground up. And it starts at the very core with a mindset. And I would often engage founders very early on that would say, this whole sales thing, I want to avoid having a sales team. I think we're building a really great product and the product's going to sell itself. We absolutely know that. Well, we know from experience that that's really not the case. Even companies that have product-led motions, like a Notion or a Slack, have fairly large B2B sales teams. And they won't necessarily talk about it much, but that's the driver for revenue growth for those companies. So yes, product-led is important as a motion, but it's more important to embrace sales as a thing you do. And as a founder, when you're starting to get these very first sales, many say, God, I don't know, I'm really scared of sales. But the thing is, you're a founder. You founded a company. You did the scariest thing you could possibly do, which is go out on your own and to build a vision from this idea to an actual product. And so how do you build that mindset around sales? Well, first, it's a story. Your story as a founder, finding a problem, working through the challenges, and coming up with this incredible solution, which is adding value to so many other organizations and companies. So understand that you have a story. That story gives you credibility. And through credibility, you're building empathy with other potential buyers of your solution that also are experiencing that same problem journey. But it's more than just being able to tell your story. See, a lot of sales that I see out there across many different organizations, whether it's startups, bigger companies, is this idea that you have to lead with your product. When in fact, leading your product misses a whole opportunity to connect with prospects. Because prospects aren't looking for a solution. They're looking for an answer to a problem that they're experiencing, sometimes not even explicitly. And this is why it's important to understand this thing called motivation. Like, what are the things that your potential customers care about most? When I was at Stack Overflow building the SaaS business, one of the key challenges that I faced was all the developers out there know what Stack Overflow is. They're using it almost every day. But the people we need to sell to, directors, VPs of engineering, CTOs at big companies, may not necessarily have been familiar with Stack Overflow. So one of the things we did early on was create this motivation matrix to break down by the different personas. So CTOs, heads of engineering, developer managers, and to understand what their key things that keep them up at night, those problem areas, and to understand what they're facing first and work backwards from the customer backwards to a solution that we could provide from a Stack Overflow perspective that would add value and help to address that problem. So start with a motivation matrix, build it out. And the other thing is, a lot of startups think, wow, I have the solution that's going to help everyone. When in fact, if you're trying to sell to everyone early on, you're really not selling to anyone. Selling to everyone's not a strategy. You got to take the time to identify your ideal customer profile. Now, sometimes this is easy if you have a highly verticalized solution. Say you're building something in the, for hospitals, or you're building something like a fintech that you're working with banks or insurance companies and providing that type of product to your customers. So you know kind of who your customer base is anyway. But sometimes there's other things that you need to unpack as well. Again, using the Stack Overflow example, early on, one of the things that we realized that we needed to have a lot of engineers to use the platform on a regular basis. So we couldn't work with smaller companies. We had to take a slice of our customer base and understand that those smaller companies, we can work with them maybe later on, but we need to get some proof points with larger enterprises and larger engineering teams. And so that was one of the ways that we started to identify our own ideal customer profile. And you can do this by company size, like we did, industries, growth rates, business models, whatever it may be, but have a really strong idea what your niche is going to be so you can tackle it and understand it deeply to connect to those customer motivations. Because ultimately, when you start to reach out to these prospects, you're going to have a message that's not about, again, pushing your product, your solution. We got to work backwards from the customer. So this is about building the right messaging. And I always start with what's in it for me, not me, or you as a startup founder, but what's in it for me from a customer perspective. And if you start there with all the messaging that you create, all the outbound motions that you start with, then you couple on top of that how your solution is relevant, then you have the right message. And what does this actually look like? I'm going to show you an example in a little bit. But once you are able to calibrate those messages, you got to know, well, who are you going to specifically reach out to? You got to be where your prospects are hanging out. So those key prospects, for example, if maybe you're selling a technology or developer related solution, where are those heads of engineering hanging out? Are you going to find them at conferences, industry groups, different communities? In my own case, my own startup, when I was doing HR tech, it was enterprise focused. So I went on LinkedIn and I identified 200 top HR executives, chief human resources officers, chief people officers of enterprises that seemed to have some level of engagement or be a little bit more active or public about their activities. And I started there on LinkedIn to identify those personas. Company culture. Okay, I'll address that in a little bit, but there's definitely ways that you can kind of understand a little bit more about the culture of companies you're trying to reach out to. Yeah. So once you've identified where your customers are hanging out and building your initial list of companies to reach out to and the personas in those companies, the people you'd actually connect with, what are you going to actually go out there with? How are you going to engage with them initially? And this whole idea of prospecting can sometimes be really wonky and mysterious. But again, I start with the what's in it for me, going from the customer first and working backwards. So this was a template that I created a while back ago that could be used as a message over email, could be using social selling like LinkedIn or other places online, or you can build this as a call script if that's a motion that you feel is going to be valuable. But the way I structured it is that you always want to start with what's interesting about the person you're wanting to talk to and engage. Have they done a talk? Was there a conference that they're at? Are they doing some interesting work? You start to build a little bit of research as you search for that person online and get an understanding of who they are. then you want to have some sort of some reaction to that, connected to a trend, why that trend is impactful, and then say, hey, I'm a startup founder. I'm working on a solution that's addressing this big trend that's happening. Would you have time to answer a few questions I have? And that was the messaging that I would go out not only with my own startup, but also other startups I'd worked with in the past as well. Some type of framework like this that, again, doesn't start with telling the prospect about your startup, your product. Start with them first and work backwards. Now, if you have done all this effectively, you have your motivation matrix, you've built out the right messaging, you have the right accounts and all the right people to reach out to, hopefully you get to start to get some positive reactions. People are interested, they want to talk, you want to set up meetings. And this is something that you need to be really careful about, particularly early on, is that not every person that expresses interest is going to be a customer. You've got to qualify out first, because some situations, some deals which look really interesting could end up being big time wasters for you. When I was at Stack Overflow, we were very diligent about understanding what our no-goes are, because if we didn't ask those up front, we can go into a whole long conversation that wasted a lot of time and didn't help not only us, but didn't help the customer. So one of those big no-goes was the platform. Would a company be able to use Microsoft, which was what Stack Overflow has been built on from the very beginning? Some big companies were not really open to having or licensing Microsoft technologies, like buying another SQL Server instance. And so if we knew that right up ahead, we could say, look, maybe this won't be a good fit right now. We can talk later on when we have maybe a different architectural footprint that you can leverage. But let's just table this conversation right now. And that saves both you time as a founder and an early stage startup, and the customer time, keeps the relationship open until maybe at a later date, you can better serve their needs. And then once you get past those no-goes, you want to understand, okay, do you actually have these challenges? Is there a priority? Because a lot of companies will tell you they have some problems. They have things they want to solve. If it's not a priority, it's not budget, if there's not any sort of motion to solve it, you're not going to have a deal. And then lastly, you also want to understand the impact. Are there other teams impacted? Is this a broader problem where you can get buy-in across the board and get more momentum around interest in bringing on your solution? And so now that you've qualified those deals and you're setting up meetings, that's great. But how do you manage these meetings? And this is an opportunity to either earn a lot of trust or go into a cycle of conversations that end up going nowhere, and you as a founder getting ghosted. So always be very intentional about the meetings. Don't waste time. Establish meeting goals, not just your goals, what you want to get out of the meeting, but also from the customer perspective. Don't ask a lot of yes, no questions. You want to prepare open-ended questions. You want them to engage, because when you look at data, lots of data that's been compiled on this very question. When a customer is engaging over 60% of the time, you're more than likely to have a deal happen at the end of this. So you need to be able to talk less and get them to express more of what is going on internally in an organization around the problems, the impact, how it impacts metrics that they're goaled on. So get them talking more. And as they're talking, you want to summarize your understanding. So you're getting these small commitments along the way. Anticipate blockers and motivators. So listen for things that could be objections, as well as things that are buying signals. And one of the things that we did in multiple instances, including at Stack Overflow, is that we had an entire doc of these blockers and motivators so that everyone on the sales team would be able to pick up on these signals during the course of a meeting, be able to address them appropriately. And then lastly, always have an actual ending. Don't leave or don't close out the meeting before you know what are the next steps. And those next steps or follow-ups should have an owner, a date, and a task. And make sure you keep up those follow-ups and stay on top of it. Now, a lot of the sale that you do actually doesn't happen because of your own actions or the actions of your salespeople. There's actually a lot that has to happen internally. And that internal sale is driven by your champion. But you got to make sure, are they really a champion? Do they have their own what's in it for me? Is it compelling? Is there something that's really driving your internal champion to support you? Can they internalize that pitch? Can they say back to you what it is that your value is from the context of their organization? And has your champion, have they actually gone and bought things in the past? If they've not, then there's going to be a whole lot more learning that has to happen in terms of that procurement process. And then lastly, are they willing to map out the organization for you to tell you who are the decision makers? If they're being cagey or not being open with providing that information, maybe they're not the right champion for you. And the other side of the internal sale is we always want to hear positive news. We are founders. There's so many things that can be so negative, and there's so many ups and downs. We latch on to things that sound good, right? We want all the good news, but we got to be really, really careful. And it's not just founders, but a lot of even seasoned sales professionals have happy years. We want to hear all the good things that are going on and ignore the negatives or the warning signs. So even though qualification is something you think about early on when you're qualifying deals to work on, qualification, asking those core questions about what's the challenge? Is it still compelling to solve? Is it still going to be impactful? Is this still something which is going to be an initiative that has value across the organization? Continue to ask those questions so you counteract the biases that we all have around only wanting to hear good news. Now, just a quick thing on contracts, because this could be an entire 2-3 hour conversation of itself, but understanding the legal and contract process is such a critical aspect of early stage sales and establishing the right motions. And at a minimum, you really got to understand some key concepts around who is the owner of intellectual property, understanding what the liabilities are if things go wrong, understanding things like termination rights and most favored status, acceptance criteria, because that could have a major impact from a revenue perspective. And this is actually most favored status is something I've known has been a real challenge for some early stage startups, because if you agree to those terms early on, that means all the other sales you have afterwards have to, they cannot go below those pricing or other types of structures when you've given someone else another customer most favored status. So be really careful about all of these types of terms because they could really impact your ability to grow and scale as a startup. And then rounding things up, negotiating. Now, everyone thinks that once everyone says, yes, this looks good, and we're going to sign, that people will sign. But I've seen way too often that deals at the 11th hour come up with questions, an issue comes up, and you'll get the dreaded phone call that says, hey, we're really excited about the deal, but we got to do this. And they can maybe push back on the price or certain terms. And it's a scary place because you don't want to say no. But understand this, if someone's trying to do something with a deal, your customer saying they're pushing back on something at the last minute, it means they still want you. They still need your product, your solution. And so understand that if this is a negotiation. So look at all the different ways to be creative about deal terms, pricing tiers, the way you deliver service, so you don't get stuck in an ongoing cycle, which I've known has happened with a few startups with bigger customers, going through months and months of negotiations and renegotiations just to get on the same page. Try to think outside the box in terms of how you can structure these deals so that it's still valuable for you and you don't give away too much, while also seeing the customer from their perspective. All right. So those are some of the key building blocks. And the reason I bring those up is because as a founder, oftentimes we think about just a few of those things, but really understanding deeply and encapsulating your experience and knowledge around those 12 areas of the sales will help you to build out that playbook so that when you start to hire your very first salespeople, they have something to work with. But what does that process look like? What is that handoff? So let me talk about the whole process of how you start to think about in a systematic and intentional way, building out your sales team. So over the course of seeing many different startups at many different stages of their growth, I've tried to break it out into 4 different phases I've seen occur over and over again with many B2B tech startups, starting with founders who are selling, then bringing on your very first sales reps, to then evolving the process and building out that repeatable model, to then being able to hit that scale motion and truly scaling your not only your organization, but the sales organization to support those growth objectives. And as the startup matures, as you start to grow from an ARR perspective, you'll see this evolution of different types of sales teams. So what does these actually look like? Well, the very first phase is you selling. And as I explained those 12 building blocks of B2B sales, this is the thing that the founders do. And you're doing this because it's a process of understanding how customers buy. And very much like building out your MVP or minimum viable product, you're at the same time, you're building out your minimally viable sales process. So you're in this discovery mode, getting in the product market fit, but also in a discovery mode to understand, well, what does a sales motion look like? And this is often at the very earliest stages when you're still very small numbers from an AR perspective. And you don't need a whole lot of process. You just need to start to record things that you're experiencing in that sales journey as you're engaging these, the first handful of customers. And this is where you apply your sales passion, because again, you may not have the experience of doing a lot of B2B sales in the past, but your sales passion, your founder's passion, will open a lot of those initial doors to allow you to get those very first customers in. And those very first customers, the focus is not on the number of customers, but the most qualified customers, because you want, at the end of these engagements, you want customers that are super excited that they brought you on and have had really great initial success using your solution. Oh, and one other thing I'd like to point out here is oftentimes people ask me about outsourced sales. I say, don't do outsourced sales, but do outsource components of the sales process. So one classic example, one thing that I think is a very easy thing, one that you should do, is outsourcing lead generation or lead creation. So the building out of those lead sheets, not necessarily the motion of going out and doing the prospecting. That's something that you as a founder really should be doing, but at least the research part, the building together of those lead lists, that's a lot of heavy lifting that you can definitely outsource to software or an organization. So after you've gotten an understanding of what that sales process kind of looks like, well, now you need to start to scale up a bit more and start to bring on people that not only have that sales experience, but are also really entrepreneurial. So at this stage, you're still working on product market fit, but you've had those initial successful sales. You have those customer examples and use cases. You're now building up a regular reoccurring revenue stream, and you understand the sales process at a high level. Not much tooling, which is fine, but you understand here are the objections, here's the qualifying criteria, here's how customers have bought our product and what the sales cycles look like. So you want a salesperson that's more of an evangelist, the person that's going to go out there, try some things out. They have the ability to tell the story. They have the ability to experiment, and they're very curious. adaptable. And you want someone that can do the full-on sales process from early stage prospecting all the way to managing a deal to closing, and maybe even some of the post-sale customer experience and customer support. So you want a salesperson that is okay getting their hands dirty, doing all the different motions around selling. And what's particularly important is that these types of salespeople are okay with ambiguity. You're going to have salespeople that need a playbook, but in this stage, you don't need playbook salespeople. You need people that are going to be okay that you don't know a whole lot, but you only know a little bit about your sales process, and you're going to let them kind of figure out the rest of it for you along the way. To the point where once you start to get a lot more sales and those early salespeople are successful, now you're probably at the stage where you got product market fit, you got strong customer validation, you're now probably maybe in the millions in ARR. Now this is a time to truly ramp up and build out a professional sales organization. So what you're doing at this stage is building out the initial structure organization so you can start to scale. And at this point, you want to have a CRM in place, so you start to rigorously track and build out the data around sales motions. You also want to start to think about, from a organization perspective, bringing on your first head of sales, whether you call them a VP, whether you call them a director, whatever it may be. You need someone who's going to be the sales leader to get you through this stage of your startup. And not only are you thinking about bringing on that first sales leader, you also need to have someone that's going to handle the ops side, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But at this stage, you pretty much know what the sales process is. There's a lot of room to optimize, though. And so the people you're going to have to bring in to help you optimize that sales process is the collaborator, the sales settler. And you need reps that are going to be willing to work together, and they're really eager to roll up their sleeves and get things done. They exhibit a lot of agency, they're problem solvers, and this is where you begin to specialize as well. So you're going to have sales development reps that do a lot more of the lead gen, early stage sales. Then you'll have account managers that are doing more of the working on qualified leads, opportunities to manage the deals and then close them out. And these are the types of reps that you want to really build the organization on. So thinking about how you hire is going to be important. Again, that's something I'll talk about in a little bit. But these are going to be your future sales leaders potentially. And that's why it's important that you get folks that are really good at collaborating, want to build the team, have that motivation to be part of something that's going to be great and scaled out. So the last stage of this sales journey is the prospectors. And this is when you know what your sales process is, you know what your product is, and now you're just hitting the gas on the accelerator to zoom up and to hopefully get to a really awesome exit. And so at this point, you're going to be at tens of millions of ARR. You understand your playbook inside and out around how to do sales and all of the minutia of each step along the way. You're building a lot of automation workflows. And now you have a much larger sales organization where you may have managers, directors, and a head of sales. And the type of salespeople you're going to really need at this stage, they are pure execution engines. They are, and that's, some people may take offense to this, but this is really the coin-operated sales reps. And the reason we say that is because they really are motivated by money, and that's totally fine, because you want the people that are they're eager and hungry to close deals, and they exhibit lots of discipline. They're very precise, process-oriented, and you give them the playbook, and they'll make it happen. So that is the profile of an organization where now you're really scaling up the organization, and having those executors are going to be critical for being able to deliver on your sales goals and revenue goals as you grow. So at this stage, now let's dig into some of the specifics I kind of introduced in the talk about the different, the 12 sales building blocks, as well as scaling up a sales team. And one of the keys to making this happen is having a sales operations and enablement function. Well, what are those functions? Well, oftentimes they get intermingled, but they're very distinct things that help support the sales organization. So sales ops, they're about maximizing productivity. They're doing a lot of things in the background that oftentimes you may not see directly as a founder, but is usually instrumental for helping a head of sales or sales VP to be effective. And this means all the reporting, forecasting, all the different tools, the data that's being collected, coverage, territories, compensation, and also just the overall collaboration, communications, and strategy for the sales organization. So that's a lot that's on the plate of someone who's running sales operations. And oftentimes, very quickly, a sales ops person you bring in is going to need to have more people underneath him or her to be able to support all the different work that's required. Sales enablement is a bit different. This is about helping the sellers on the ground, out in the field, close more deals. And this has a lot to do with training, onboarding, providing the tools, messaging, information that sellers need in their hands and in their heads to be most effective. And oftentimes sales enablement will work very closely with sales operations, but they are definitely distinct functions. Early on, you're going to start with sales ops, but at some point, as you start to scale and you want to make those sales settlers and prospectors most effective, you're going to have a sales enablement function as well to make sure that those sellers are enabled and have the knowledge to be successful when they're speaking with prospects and customers. The next thing is, well, how many salespeople are you bringing on? What's the math behind that? So there will be different perspectives on this. Again, this is a very generalized view of how you think about sales capacity. But broad strokes is that many folks, when they ask me about hiring sales reps, to say, yeah, we're heading into the new year and I think we need to get like 20 more reps. I'm like, okay, well, do you sure you need 20 more reps? If you're starting hiring right at the beginning of next year, are they going to be ready to be effective? And that's why I think about ramp time is so critical. Oftentimes it's going to take 2, 3, 6 months, depending on the complexity of your solution, the market that you're selling into, to get up to speed. So you got to incorporate that in your hiring process. Oftentimes I say, look, if you're hiring for your plan in 2023, you should really be thinking about now to start to hire and bring on those sales reps and to onboard them through the process so they're ready to start being productive as soon as you start the new fiscal year. And on top of that, you also got to think about the productivity. Like, how many deals are you closing per rep? What's the average contract value? You got to take into account that sales reps are going to leave for a number of different reasons. And also, you should have a buffer. Don't make it don't leave yourself on razor's edge to ensure the team that you're building is going to actually produce. A lot of things can happen, so make sure you have a buffer in place. So as you start to think about all these components of a sales capacity plan, that you are prepared to deliver on the revenue numbers that you've promised your board. Now, what about the actual hiring process? And one of the people I hugely admire around this whole space of sales leadership, and building out sales ops for startups is Mark Roberge at HubSpot, who took HubSpot from 0 to 100 million in ARR. And obviously HubSpot's been massively successful as a public company. But he boiled it down to this, which is sales hiring is going to be the most critical component for being successful in your sales. And at Amazon, AWS, we think we have a very data-driven approach to hiring. And it starts with thinking about the different stages by which the candidate walks through in that experience and how they engage and learn about your organization and how you get a better understanding of them as a potential person to bring on board onto the team. And so be really intentional, even in the early stages when you're hiring your very first sales rep. Have a sales process that you've laid out with the types of questions that you would ask, the types of people that they would talk to, how you execute interviews, how you capture information in those interviews and debrief afterwards, so you are all on the same page when you start to decide on which candidates to bring on to the organization. And when I think about questions themselves, a lot of questions that we ask in interviews don't actually elicit a whole lot of useful information for you to evaluate the ability for a candidate to come in and have impact in your startup. So at Amazon and many other organizations as well, we use the STAR technique. So you want to ask behavioral type questions where a candidate can share an example of their work. So what's the situation? What was the example that they're providing about work that they did? What were the tasks, the actual specific things that they owned to address the situation? What actions did they take to achieve outcomes? And what were the results? It could be qualitative, it could be quantitative, but you need to understand, well, if they did this work, well, why was it positive? Why did it actually have any sort of impact? And the other thing that is important, this is an example of a very basic scoring rubric that I put together for a startup I was advising a few years back, is having a regular set of questions, a question bank that anyone that's going through as an interviewer, that's interviewing candidates, can go to, and then score what their impressions are, as well as having notes on how those candidates are responding to these questions. And why this is important is that later on, as you start to look at sales performance and sales reps that have been successful versus those that haven't, you can oftentimes trace it back to something in the hiring process that maybe you skipped or didn't necessarily get as much clarity on. So yeah, I definitely recommend starting very early on, having a data-driven approach to selling or to hiring. Well, once you've hired folks, what is the culture in order to maintain a high level of performance? And sometimes I'll show this in a bunch of different talks I give, but sales culture and startup culture generally is not the things that you see. It's not the physical aspects that you see, but it's something that's behind the scenes. And again, I rely upon HubSpot for a lot of insights here, but there always is a culture that happens. It's whether you are intentional about establishing it early on. And I'm always a big believer of, much like at Amazon, we have our leadership principles. There should be principles by which you define the sales culture. And when you have those principles in place, make sure to incorporate them into the training and onboarding process, how you're hiring and interviewing, the language that you use in documentation and meetings, and the displays of culture through recognition and rewards that you give for folks that do outstanding work. Really think about how to make the culture and the principles that you espouse in your startup alive with the team. And also think about how it changes over time, because much like the 4 levels or steps I shared around how a sales team evolves, the culture will evolve as well, because you're bringing different types of people in to do the work as your startup starts to mature and evolve. So always think about and revisit the assumptions that you had. Even for Amazon, we didn't start with 16 leadership principles. In fact, we added 2 in the time that I've been at Amazon over the past 2.5 years. So revisit that culture and make sure it's really tracking to what your organization is all about and the principles you espouse. So lastly, I'll leave it here with just some common things that I've seen time and time again to just keep in mind. The very first is that I think it's hard to start to bring on salespeople or outsource your selling processes if you haven't sold first as a founder. And it's really important to get that understanding as you're starting to look at product market fit. you also need to really think about the hiring process in a very intentional and systematic way, because the way that you hire is going to have huge impact in terms of being able to get to that point where you are establishing a repeatable sales process. And as you start to scale your sales, make sure you scale your marketing and customer success in unison. A big mistake is putting all your chips into sales without thinking about the lead generation that's going to help salespeople be successful. If you don't have enough leads, you're starving your sales team. But on the back end as well, if you don't have customer success stories that are being created because customers are wildly successful, that's also going to be a real challenge for your sellers. As you start to scale up a sales team, make sure you bring on the type of sales leadership that has experience at your level of startup maturity. If you don't, you're going to have a leader who's going to really struggle to try and figure out how to scale your organization to the next level. And then, just to repeat what I said before, as you start to scale in terms of velocity, in terms of volume, really make sure that your sellers are equipped with the types of leads and sales ops support that are going to help them be successful. So just a few resources that are going to be, I think, hopefully helpful for folks. I wrote about all the 12 building blocks of founder-led sales in this blog or series of blog posts on the AWS Startups blog. I also wrote a separate prospecting manifesto, and I have a regular newsletter that I send out called the Enterprise Sales Forum. And here are a few books that I found have been not only valuable for myself, but have been really valuable from founders who I've recommended these books to, as well as founders that on their own have recommended these books to people that they know. To Sell as Humans, kind of a classic. I do like books like Influence, Never Split the Difference is really great for negotiating skills. Some of the science and biases around selling, such as Thinking Fast and Slow and the Science of Selling, are really good. And then Mark Roberge, he wrote the Sales Acceleration Formula, which goes into all the details of how he built, grew, and scaled HubSpot Salesforce. And so with that, if any questions, I'll be happy to take them. And again, you can scan the QR code if you want to chat after, or that's the wrong email address. I mistyped. It's MBIRC.
Hi, Mark. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Praneet.
I asked you that question around tracking for company culture, and you said you'll cover it. So, like, how does one typically go about doing that in a world where we are essentially filtering leads on LinkedIn and whatnot? And ours is a sales tech platform, so it's very relevant even from the other perspective. Your entire talk.
Yeah. So, understanding the culture of a company. And again, it depends on how much work and research you want to do. But very early on, again, it's not about volume. It's about getting and understanding whether there's some synergy or alignment there potentially. And a lot of companies put a lot of stuff around their culture out there on the internet. So just doing a quick search, you can look at their About Us page for most companies. Some even have encapsulated on an entire page their values. For bigger companies, if you're doing enterprise sales, you'll always see mention of their vision, their culture, their principles or values in their annual shareholder docs or reports that they do. So there's a voluminous amount of information around getting an understanding of culture. And that's where I would start if you want to hone in on culture aspects. And I don't necessarily think about, to that point, I don't key in on necessarily the principles or values as much, but where are they going? Like, what is their future? What's their North Star? So if their North Star is we're going to just continue to be this like brand whatever, you're not really getting signals of innovation. or customer obsession, like things that might be valuable in terms of what you're trying to deliver as a solution. So it's something maybe to think about or consider as you start to identify your ideal customer profile. Hopefully that helped.
Yeah, it was definitely helpful. Thanks.
Sure. Any other thoughts? Where are folks kind of in their own journey? Is it still very early on, and most people doing founder-led sales at this stage? Feel free to go off mute or go on video if you want. Always curious to kind of get a sense of where folks are at in their own journey. So a lot of founder-led sales, or have you brought on your first sales reps?
Yeah, so for us, we're still at the founder-led sales. Actually, we are like closing our first client. So we just completed the first prototype of our product, and we are hoping like we onboarded our first client like a week ago, and we are hoping to go to like a few more to validate like the product and show that we can actually generate value for our customers.
Super cool.
I actually had a question as well. So this was regarding sales hiring. So I come from a technical background. So I mean, while I might like learn to do sales myself, but say like 6 months to a year from now, when I want to hire my first salespeople, what do I like look for, or what questions do I ask in an interview to determine like if they would be a good hire for me?
I always lean on behavioral questions. And yes, I will. I can definitely share the presentation. I'll work with the ML Elevate team to provide the slides after this presentation. I always lean on behavioral questions because I want to get examples and details about what they've done. Right? And it's easier to do this if you've done some of the sales, and if not necessarily yourself, like any one of your co-founders, to capture some of those experiences, because then you can ask questions, again, setting up a situation. The behavioral side of it is, how would you think about or can you share an example of when you have sold a machine learning developer tool, or whatever it is that you're doing? And then you want that person to provide the situation, share what he or she specifically did. You want to call out things when they do like we or very passive language, and you want to understand, well, what actions did they take, and then lastly, be able to quantify what the results are. Now it's a bit easier in sales because it's a very metrics driven type of motion. It's very different in, say, like maybe like product or other things in an organization. So at least from the metric standpoint, like that should be proven out, but you want to understand the thinking process. Like, why did they do this? And it's important not to just ask the question, let someone just kind of go and run with it. And you may think this might be like rude, or you don't want to interrupt people. No, you interrupt because you want to dive deeper. Like, okay, so tell me, like, why did you make that decision? Like, why did you decide to skip over talking to the VP of engineering and go directly to the CTO? Don't you think that would have been a risk to the relationship? So really dive deep and understand, are they thinking of sales in a more systematic, intentional approach, or are they kind of winging it? You want to shy away from people that don't actually have at least some sort of process or rigor to what they do in terms of their thinking and actions. Also, the other thing is, each one of those stages I mentioned come with different types of behaviors you need from a sales perspective. So you also want to understand the type of situation that a salesperson has been exposed to. Like, you don't want someone at your next stage, when you start to bring on those early sales reps, you may not want someone who's been at a big, huge enterprise tech company and has only been at a big, huge enterprise company selling, because you're going to need someone who rolls up his or her sleeves and does everything. Someone who's been at the big tech company may have only done a small slice of sales. So also think about that as well.
Yeah, and just a small follow-up question to that. How
Yeah.
important is the background? So, like, do I want to hire people who have like machine learning sales backgrounds, or like, is it okay to like go wider and look for people who have like sold tech in general, or even if they've like sold something else? How transferable are like these sales skills, particularly to like a tech-intensive product like us,
Yeah.
where it's like machine learning or something very technical?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've gone back and forth on this actually. So my thinking has evolved. And someone that you may want to follow is a Jason Lemkin, Storm Ventures, because he writes a lot about sales, and he runs this event called SaaSter. And he convinced me to maybe rethink this, because particularly early on, you want people that are going to be really driven, have that sales mindset and know how to sell. And it could be anything. See, the content can be learned. And particularly as you evolve from founder-led sales to building out a sales team, you're going to be involved anyway very early on. So the sellers that you bring on are going to learn the content. Then later on, as you evolve to next stages, this is when sales enablement becomes really critical. Now, do you want people that are like maybe completely different industries? We're selling, plumbing supplies versus tech. I don't know if you want to go that far. The other thing I'd say is, don't be dazzled by a lot of prestigious names or a lot of deep industry background, because maybe that could be valuable. But oftentimes I've seen that not be any better than bringing someone who's just super driven, who wants to get something done, wants to build, and is excited for your vision. That to me is going to be a lot more applicable than bringing in the quasi industry expert.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Yush. Question: are there any lead indicators for product market fit in the context of moving from founder-led sales to next level team? Looks like everybody wants to build code and very few want to sell nowadays. Yes. Product-led or product market fit indicators, it can be very different. And I don't want to kind of like derail or get down like a long rabbit hole here, but it definitely is a feeling when you start to have conversations, those initial conversations with prospects that tend to go more positively. You start to see an uptick in activity, whether it's your website or product usage, and you start to connect the dots on things that show traction from different angles. And again, like product market fit it's not binary. It's not like you were pre-product market fit, now you're post-product market fit. It evolves, right? Because your product will evolve, your understanding of market will evolve, and you'll get a much better understanding. And there's been products or companies that I've worked with early days, like Outreach is a perfect example. They were building CRM for recruiters. It did okay, and they thought they had product market fit. But it wasn't until they started working with SaaS teams that were building out sales development rep teams or SDR teams that they really took off and became a unicorn. So sometimes you may think you have product market fit, but again, it evolves, and once you get that better understanding, you're better equipped to really start to accelerate and get to that next stage in your startup's growth journey. Next question is, can you talk about some lead generation tools or services that you had shown in slides? Yeah, I tend not to talk too much about tools because it changes and evolves so much. But I'll tell you what I've done in the past. So I have actually leveraged a lot of outsourced lead list generation teams. And these are services you could find in a lot of places. I've used teams in the Philippines, in Costa Rica, in different places where all they're doing is the background research, right? So there's no risk of any sort of backlash with potential customers. And that kind of data lift is so beneficial, because if you can take that off your shoulders, you're saving a lot of time. Nowadays, there's a lot of tools that have come on the market that I think are super interesting. One which is Apollo.ai is one of them. There's a ton that are doing these kind of LinkedIn tools that can allow you to build lists directly from LinkedIn. So those are some things that you may want to look into. But when it comes to actual implementing automation around outbound selling, I would tend to avoid doing a lot of that in the early days, because again, you're not looking at volume. You're really looking to understand the sales process and the buyer motivations. So it's okay to do things that don't scale sometimes, and this is a perfect example. Later on, yes, you want to employ sales automation, but that's when you have the sales team. Hopefully that helps. Next question is, how do you make someone shift from existing vendors-based process to new ways of doing things? And it's a classic innovation challenge, right? Again, it depends on the types of accounts you're targeting. If you're targeting startups, it's usually not a big deal. Or even like small to mid-sized businesses, not so hard. When you're talking to large enterprises, it's a bit different. Now, this is where having an internal champion is so valuable, because understand, big companies, they are buying new tools all the time. The challenge is, if you're on the outside, you don't know what that process looks like. And particularly when it's that Stack Overflow, we were working with these big, huge banks, for example. Like, a lot of financial services customers were our very first Stack Overflow for Teams customers. And we had to go through that entire journey of being set up as a vendor. But again, if you've identified it's the triangle of problem, impact, your solution. And if all of them come together, then you potentially have a buyer and a champion inside the organization that can help you through that process, from due diligence, risk assessment, security reviews, legal contract reviews, as well as basic procurement setup, like setting yourself up as a vendor. So definitely rely upon your champion, but the only way you get to that stage is if you have that initial alignment on problem, impact, solution. Hopefully that helps. Yeah, thank you. It's been an honor, and good luck with all the rest of the talks and sessions. It's a wonderful program. Take care now.